Okay, let me review a little bit about morphology. So let me just show you some more examples of inflection. For example, in Latin, the verb amare, to love, it's inflected like amo is I love. You don't need to say the pronouns, it's in the verb. Amas, you love. Amat, she loves. Amamas, we love. Amatas, you plural love. Amant, they love. So it's inflected for person, like first person I, second person you, third person she, they. Singular, plural. Singular is like I, you, she, plural, we, you all, they, as well as things like tense, present, future, past tense, voice, like active, like I love you, and passive, like I was loved by you, I love chocolate, the boy was very loved by his parents, passive voice. And then we'll talk about some other things later. So Latin is very inflectional. I loved Latin in high school. I was a nerd. Because like a single verb can have hundreds of different forms, all of these inflections. And Greek was even more complex, and I loved it. It was fun. People thought I was strange. Now Spanish kind of went the other direction, went kind of more, what we say, analytical, using function words instead of inflections. A little bit. So Spanish verbs are inflected like in the singular, kind of like that, just like Latin. But then there's more use of pronouns for like objects, so te amo, Spanish, I love you, but for the infinitive, quiero, I want, and amarte, so amar is the infinitive, and the object pronoun can be glued onto the infinitive in Spanish, dependent infinitive, like I want to love you, like, oh chocolate, I want to love you, but you make me fat, quiero amarte. So gluing pronouns onto verbs. Now you just take that further, gluing other function words onto verbs, and that's how you get like really complex inflectional languages like Turkish, where you glue lots of things onto verbs, and they're not function words anymore, but they're just inflectional morphemes. So Turkish, Georgian, Inuit, those languages are famous for very complex inflectional morphology, so the verb inflections indicate subjects and objects and all kinds of stuff. These are languages I should probably study someday. They're probably interesting. Then Latin has these noun case systems. Can you see that? So in morphology and inflection, we have something called noun cases, for example, in Western languages. So a nominative, so you'll see these terms, nominative, you don't need to memorize these, but nominative is the term for like the subject. So Latin nouns and adjectives have a marker for a subject. Sentence subject, like the master is. Possessive or genitive, dative, which is indirect object, accusative, which is a direct object, and then a lot of Western languages have maybe some special kind of morphological inflectional cases for different prepositional meanings. So Latin has one, this is kind of simplified. Latin has one for like from or by means of or away from, things like that. And other languages have others. Finnish is pretty complex because it has quite a few special noun case systems. Okay. And let me walk through another example of English, like the un. So unlockable has two meanings. One is if you take unlock, so un can negate a verb, which means to reverse. So unlock is to reverse the locking process. So unlockable can mean it cannot be. So it can be unlocked, or un can negate an adjective and just mean the opposite. So lockable means it can be locked, and unlockable, it can't be locked. So these are two different meanings, and this may be confusing, I guess, for you if you learn English as a second language. The un either reverses the meaning of a verb, or it negates the noun. And we saw this with unbuttonability, where it's either unbutton ability, that you can unbutton it, or it's unbuttonability, like it's not buttonable. You can't button it up. We talked about compound nouns. So prosodic means like things like stress and intonation. The prosodic head of compounds is usually the first element, but morphologically and semantically, the last part is the head, the most important part. So greenhouse is a noun because house is a noun. And it's a type of house or structure. Hand chopper it's some kind of a chopper. So it's a noun because it's a chopper. And the ER, by the way, is an agentive suffix meaning doing something. It does something. It's an agent. It does something. It does an action. So ER is an Old English, Anglo-Saxon. The Latin equivalent is OR in some words. So ER is Old English and OR is Latin. They're both agent suffixes. So an agent is a doer of an action. Another kind of morphology we didn't show. You ever wonder why in English we go man, men, woman, women? Well, it's the old German part of our language. In German, you form plurals by changing the internal vowel sometimes in some words, not always, but that's one way of doing plurals in German. Gastgäste, Züge, Buchbücher, Haushäuser. And also for Mädchen, which is a derivational morpheme, it's called a diminutive. So diminutive is like making something little, like girl, girly. So the E in like girly, hey girly, you might say to a child, hey girly. Diminutive and such. Or German, Mädchen is just a normal word for girl, but the Schen, there's an old German word, Magd, and it's from that. So you change the vowel, Ablaut or Umlaut, and add the Schen suffix, which is a diminutive. But also this occurs in German and English with irregular or strong verbs. They're called strong verbs because they defy the normal inflectional pattern. They don't add ed, they do their own thing. So like verbs in English like sing, sang, sung, or German singen, sang, gesungen, these are strong verbs. Changing the internal vowel. It's another kind of morphology. And I guess if you're Asian, you might find it weird. But it's not unusual in Western languages. Arabic and Hebrew are known for doing this. It's a language I don't speak, but in addition to inflectional and derivational endings in Arabic and Hebrew, you also can change the internal vowel. So you take a word like KTB, like kitab. The word for book in Arabic and Hebrew is something like kitab, I think, and it's also in a lot of languages have borrowed that. Bantu languages, Swahili, they borrow that from Arabic a lot. Kitab is book, and a lot of nouns and verbs related to book or writing or reading are from that stem, changing the vowels as well as adding endings. Oops, or prefixes. Maybe talk about these for a couple of minutes again. We were talking about these last time. Maybe if I can do this. What's the relationship between the two elements of these compounds? Book cover. So what's the semantic relationship of book and cover? Right? Dust cover, dust cloth. What's the semantic relationship between the first noun and the head noun? Okay, what is used on, what is used for? So it's sort of like a purpose, or it's not exactly necessarily an object, maybe sort of. Well, sometimes, I mean, dust cover is not for covering dust, but it's for purposes of preventing dust, so the dust cover. So it's some kind of like purpose kind of relationship. A purpose, or bird seed, it's sort of similar, but it's maybe more like you're actually going to give it to birds. So it's kind of like a dative, like you give an indirect object, you give something to somebody, dog food. And I hope people don't misunderstand, like it's not food made from dogs, it's food for dogs. Salad shooter. So what's a salad shooter? Or an onion chopper? Some of these may be more cultural, like only Americans would buy something as pointless as a salad shooter. It's like for a lawnmower. Okay, what's the relationship? An onion chopper chops onions. So onion is sort of like an object, chopping onions. You see the relationship? It's sort of like an object. Lawnmower it's for mowing lawns. A pastry chef is a chef who makes pastries, and so on. Bank robbery, robbing a bank. Kind of similar. Dog lover. Cat lover, cat hater, is sort of the object, although as we'll see later it's a little different. Then hand chopper, hand presser, for pressing your hand. Yeah? No. Here, what is hand? It's not an object, hopefully, but it's what you use. It's like the instrument, the hand chopper. 6, ghost story, bird book. What is a ghost story? What is a bird book? Yeah, like what's it about? Sort of like maybe call it a topic or a theme. See some more examples. Coffee cup, it's like a container for your coffee. So there's like a container. Apple juice. What is apple juice? Pretty obvious, but we need to talk about the semantics. What's the semantic relationship? Yeah, it's the material. It's juice made from apple. It's kind of similar, snowball and raindrop. Now, sometimes though, some of them are kind of more like grammatical, like objects and instruments. There's a sort of grammatical relationships. Then some are kind of more metaphorical or different. Heartache. What is a heartache? A stomach ache? What's a heartache? What is the heart? It's like a place. You could think the heart is aching, but more often I think in English we think of this as the location where do you feel the pain? Heartache, headache, etc. Door handle, table leg, frog legs. Frog legs are good if you never had them. Taste like chicken. What are these? Door handle. It's a part, whole relationship, part. And that's an important semantic relationship, as we'll see sometimes. What, ape man? Some of these are kind of more like associations. Ape man, courtyard, doorway. Some of them are kind of associations. 7, rhinoceros beetle. I think in Korean it's called sasambalé, but in English we call it a rhinoceros beetle. Because why? It looks like a rhinoceros. So more like similarity. So it's a similarity kind of metaphor. A horse statue. It's a statue that looks like a horse. It's not. In compounds, we have certain semantic relationships that kind of mirror sentence grammar, because a hand chopper is for chopping by hand, instrument, by means of. An onion chopper, the onion is sort of a semantic object, or the term in semantics is patient. And why? It's like a hospital patient. Well, the word patient comes from a Latin verb meaning to undergo or to suffer. So if you're in the hospital, you are undergoing treatment and you're suffering from a disease. So an object, for a common type of object in semantics is called patient, something that is affected by the action. So if it's affected by the action directly, it's a patient. That's a technical term in semantics. So onion is a patient. It is affected by the action of chopping. So it's a patient object. Patient, not meaning, let's say, patiently enduring. Oh, I don't mind if you chop me. No, it's affected by the action. Locative, or location, heartache. Theme, so like bird, book, ghost story, the theme or topic of what it's about. And then agent, so like, you could also maybe argue that hand chopper is either an instrument or it's an agent. The hand is doing the action, or the hand is the instrument by which you chop it. So an agent is a doer of an action. Then we also saw some others, part, whole, material, just associative like ape man. And then I noticed like some languages have other kinds of compounds. I don't think we have this in English. So Chinese da xiao. What is that? That means what? It means size, like clothing size, right? But it's a compound of da, meaning big, and xiao, meaning small. Da xiao, size. And that is sort of, it's kind of like a part-whole relationship. There's a special term for it. You call it metonymy or merism. Useful terms if you want to study literature, because these come up in literature and poetry. So in poetry, for example, I don't know, my heart ached day and night. Well, day and night is a merism. Two different parts make a whole, meaning all the time. My heart suffered day and night, all the time. So merism is a Greek word for whole, so a whole, or metonymy is when you use a part for a whole, or merism, 2 parts for a whole, so you can call it metonymy or merism. That's more of a semantic metaphor. So some of the semantics are metaphorical, and then some of them are more like, kind of like sentence roles, like onion chopper and hand chopper. Let's talk about verbs a bit. Intransitive verbs, or in Korean it's 자동사. Then we have transitive verbs. So transitive verb, or 타동사, I think in Korean, is a verb that takes a direct object. It takes an object, it's a transitive. So transitive verbs, I ran, and transitive verbs like the spider ate the fly. Are these intransitives the same? For example, are the subjects the same? You were maybe taught in school that the subject of a verb is a doer of the action, like when you're a kid, or when you were learning English as a second language or learning some other foreign language. The subject is a doer of an action, or in semantics we call it the agent, one who actually does something. Take a look at these for a minute. Are the subjects all agents? If not, what are they? Talk to each other for a minute. What are they? Are they agents or are they doing something else? All right, let's talk about the previous slide. Okay, I ran. Is the subject an agent? Is the subject a doer of an action? Yeah, I think that's pretty clearly an agent subject. But the dog slept all night. Is the dog a doer of an action? Okay, probably yeah. What about the door closed, like the door closed by itself? Is the door an agent? Does the door say, I'm going to close myself? Is that how it works? Unless it's some kind of cartoon reality or something. Is the door an agent? Is the door actually doing something? Is the door doing an action? No. So what is it? It's not an agent. You have any idea what it is? It's like a patient. And so some linguists will kind of argue. Some will say it's a theme. It's what the sentence is about. So some will call it a theme. A lot of linguists will say it's a patient. Why? It is undergoing an action. So even though it's a subject, it is undergoing an action. So it's like in the next slide we see passive sentences like the fly was eaten. So the spider ate the fly, spider. So the spider captured the fly. Spider is obviously an agent. The fly is a patient. It's an object that is directly affected by the action. Then the fly, so in a passive sentence, of course, the subject can often be a patient. The fly was captured, the fly was eaten. The fly is affected by the action. It's like an object. So passive, the object is moved to the subject position. Likewise, when you say the door closed by itself, is there an agent in the sentence? No. It's either not known or it's not relevant. Maybe it was a person, maybe it was the wind, magic or telepathy, telekinesis, close, like that. You don't know or you don't care. It's not relevant. The door. So it's very similar to the door was closed by someone. It's a patient like that, and we'll see how that affects Korean in a minute. The car disappeared. Is the car an agent? Is the car actively doing something? Car decides, I'm going to disappear. I'm going to drown myself in the lake. Okay, yeah. So maybe the driver did, but here in this sentence, is the car an agent? No. What is it? Yeah, it's a patient. So most linguists would say it's a patient. Now, a few linguists, there are some technical reasons who would say it's a theme, but don't worry about that. But yeah, it's basically a patient. It is affected by the action. It undergoes a change of state. So you see this a lot with verbs of change of state, verbs of state change. So the door closed, it's undergoing a state change of state by itself. We don't care who caused it or what did it, whatever. Same thing with the car disappeared, the car appeared, the sun arose. Okay, you don't care what made the sun rise, all irrelevant. Zeus, Thor, whatever, Odin, whatever gods you believe in. Santa Claus exists. Santa Claus an agent? Of course not. What is it? Probably a theme. Again, different linguists will have different, depending on their particular theory, they'll have different interpretations, but most linguists, a lot of linguists would say it's a theme. It's what the sentence is about. It's not doing anything, it's a theme. Although with these verbs, there are certain grammatical similarities in their inflections in different languages. Verbs of state, like exist, happen, occur, and verbs of change of state, disappear, appear, they seem to pattern together, even though the subjects might be themes or patients. For some reason in different languages, they seem to kind of have similar grammatical patterns. If you've learned German, for example, you notice that in the German perfect tense, verbs of state and verbs of change of state form their past tense differently than other verbs, the perfect tense. We'll see a similarity in Korean in a minute. So we talked about this. It is raining is it. What is it? It's nothing. Is there a subject or is an agent in weather expressions in English or French or Spanish? No. So that's the funny thing about weather verbs in English and other European languages. No subject. The it isn't really anything. It's a dummy pronoun. It's a filler pronoun. Because you need a pronoun, the rules say you need a pronoun or some kind of a subject in the sentence, but there is no logical subject. These are subjectless verbs but you put in an it because you need something there. Sounds weird. Raining. You just say raining or is raining, and then it sounds weird. I am thirsty. Is I an agent? No. What is it? Is it a patient? No, it's not exactly. When you say I'm thirsty, it's like you're experiencing thirst. Now, some linguists might call it a theme, but most linguists would say it is a type of subject. It's an experiencer subject. So verbs and adjectives that indicate like perception or psychological states, like I am thirsty, the subject is an experiencer. It's experiencing an action. It's not doing anything. And a few linguists might say it's a theme, but most linguists would say it's an experiencer. We call it an experiencer. I am scared. What is I here? It's an experiencer. You're experiencing an emotional state. So verbs of emotional states, psychological states, adjectives, verbs of states or perception. I'm thirsty, I'm hungry. These are experiencers. So these are not agents, you're taught. Suddenly grammar is a lot more complicated and interesting. And this is one of the reasons, the early days of trying to teach computers to do language was a little hard. This is one of the many reasons. Korean is difficult. What is Korean? Okay, some might call it, so different linguists could analyze this in different ways depending on their theory of semantics. There are different views. Some might call it a theme, like a topic, and that's possible, that's plausible. Others might call it something else. So if you say, for example, I am scared, okay, I is an experiencer. But if you say, I don't know, the monster scared the boy, who's the experiencer? The boy. So what is the monster? If the boy experiences a psychological state of scared, fear, what is the monster? Is it an agent? Well, it's not really an action, and the object is not a patient, it's an experiencer. So what is the monster? What is the monster doing? What's its role? Any ideas? It's causing a mental state or causing a perception. So you might call it a cause or a stimulus. And so you could say that maybe here Korean is the cause or stimulus. And so I know for you Koreans, you find English difficult, but for us, Korean is quite difficult. It's definitely difficult for me. Now, so John is easy to please. What is John here in the first one? John is easy to please. A classic example, we talked about this the first week or so. What is John? So what's the implied subject of please? Who is doing the pleasing? Yeah, somebody. It's not expressed, it's a generic subject, so anybody, someone, anyone is the unexpressed subject. So leaving out that subject makes the verb, the meaning more generic. And then what's the object of please? John. So John is probably, you could say it's a patient. You could argue this may be an experiencer, most likely a patient, because it's a direct object. Now what about John is eager to please? What's the subject of to please? What's the implied subject of to please? John. So John is more like an agent in this case. He's doing the pleasing. Yeah, that's a good question. Get into like you try to look at a whole bunch of verbs and where do you draw the line between an agent and a stimulus? If it's like a cognitive or psychological thing, like to scare, it's more clearly a stimulus. With a verb like please, you get into these gray areas, and different linguists will maybe argue about it, and you could take a whole graduate level course on these what we call semantic roles. And there's not necessarily agreement among linguists about certain verbs. Certain verbs, it seems to maybe could go either way, and maybe I don't know. Maybe it's a little bit of both. Who knows? Yeah. So there are interesting gray areas like this where people have disagreements. It's not something I lose sleep over. Common L2 errors. So East Asian students will commonly make these mistakes. I am boring. So I did the daily poll question, and it's not your fault. It's a matter of these semantic grammatical differences between the languages, English and your language, and maybe your teachers didn't tell you. Maybe your teachers made the same mistakes. So don't feel bad. I am boring. What does that mean? Yeah, so it means that In this case, these kinds of predicates, like ing forms of verbs, like what we call psych verbs or cognitive verbs, verbs of cognitive or psychological states, like bore, to bore. With the ing form, the present participle, the subject is a stimulus or cause. So if you say, I am boring, yeah, like as soon as you walk into the room, we all fall asleep. Yeah, you have that, no. So this is a mistake you don't want to make. This is a common error that Koreans and Japanese make, for example, and again, it's not your fault, just the languages are different. I am scary, meaning you are a stimulus, you cause fright to other people. So instead, you want to say, hopefully, I am scared. And I am bored. I am bored. You experience boredom. So if you say, I am bored, you are the experiencer. I am interesting. Yeah, maybe to your psychologist, you're a very interesting patient. You know. Okay. This sounds odd. You probably want to say, I'm interested in it, or in Korean, these have different meanings. So in English, I am interested, meaning I have an interest in this, or maybe in Korean it has other meanings, so maybe mean I'm having fun, or I like it, or something like that. I am difficult. What does that mean? So maybe you can say this literally in Korean, but it doesn't work in English, because in English, when you say, I am difficult, what does that mean? Yeah, you're a difficult person to handle. You cause difficulty for other people. You probably don't want to say that, unless you really are a person with a bad attitude. So in English, predicates of ease or difficulty, or linguists also often call them tough expressions, have a different semantic role. These are called semantic roles or argument structure. And you don't want to say, I am easy in English or in other European languages, because that can have a sexual meaning. So don't say that. The subject is whatever the cause or stimulus is for predicates like difficult, tough, easy, hard. So better versions, I'm bored, I'm scared, I'm interested in something, or I'm having fun. It is difficult for me, this is difficult for me. So with tough expressions, the experiencer can be expressed with for, like it is difficult for me to learn Korean. The experiencer is with for. It is hard for me to learn Korean. It's hard for me to learn Japanese. Or Korean is difficult for me to learn, or Korean is difficult for me, something like that. So this is a real practical application of your linguistics knowledge. So these are semantic roles: patient, agent, experiencer, stimulus. We call these semantic roles. There's some other terms I'll show you in a minute, but these are semantic roles. So subjects are not always doers or agents. Subjects could be patients, they could be experiencers, they could be stimulus or cause, and they could be other things as well. But these are the ones that are really tricky for language learners. Why do Koreans and Japanese and other learners of English make these mistakes? Santa Claus was existed, Davy Bowie was died, a unicorn was suddenly appeared in my garden. So think of an American house, you look out your kitchen window and you see a unicorn in your garden. This is a famous example. So if we talk about there is sentences, a famous linguist came up with this example: there's a unicorn in my garden. It's a famous example from a famous linguist. So I'm using that. We'll talk about there is if we have time later on. But a unicorn was appeared in my garden, or the car was disappeared into a thick fog. Why do Koreans and Japanese make these errors? Okay, here's some more. Second set. And I see these as a writing teacher. Okay, let's talk about the first one. So these are intransitive verbs of state or state change, change of state. So Santa Claus was existed, Davy Bowie was died. So for example, was appeared, was disappeared. These, of course, are just not possible sentences in English. These are just clearly ungrammatical. These are intransitive verbs and they cannot be made passive. So why do Koreans and Japanese learners incorrectly passivize these verbs? Well, in Korean, if you look at, for example, the second set, let's go to the second set. The door was closed, or the door closed. So in Korean, So the transitive verb, like I close the door, it's what? Yeah, tatta, yeah. But if you say the door closed, either the door closed by itself or the door was closed by somebody else. Yeah, tachida, tachisoyo. So you have in Korean the same form, right? So tachida can either be passive, a passive meaning the door was closed by the wind, or the state change, meaning the door closed, like by itself. The door is a patient in, so either way the door is a patient. The door was closed by the wind, it's a patient. The door closed by itself, the door is a patient. So in Korean they have the same verb. But in English we distinguish the passive, the true passive, the door was closed by somebody or by the wind, and the state change, meaning the door closed by itself. In English we distinguish them grammatically. In Korean you don't. You have, oftentimes you have the same verb for both, the passive and the state change meaning. And so grammatically also, not only change of state, but verbs of state or existence seem to work the same way. Now I don't know, what's the verb here? What verb would you use in Korean for exist? The same as the past tense, okay. So use the past tense verb. So I have noticed this with like 잘생겼어요, like he or she is handsome. So using the past tense, because it's acting like if it's a state, maybe it's maybe the result of something that happened in the past. Maybe I'm not sure if that's how Koreans view it. I'm not sure. My Korean here is really limited, but it seems like grammatically in a lot of languages, just the verbs of state tend to pattern grammatically with the state change verbs, like was closed and such. And so it's common for Koreans. If you have a fuller explanation, please let me know. So what suddenly appeared, so it's a state change. So you could, so it's a patient, so you might interpret it as like a passive action because it's a patient, just like a passive verb. And was disappeared, or the car disappeared. So with the, especially with 3 and 4, I can see how Koreans and Japanese, and again, I don't know so I'm not sure about those verbs, but at least in English, Koreans and Japanese, I guess, interpret it as a patient subject, which it is, but then they just write it as passives. It's maybe easier to explain these. The door was closed, meaning state change by itself. Now, close in English can be, so in Korean you have different forms for the regular transitive, like tatta, and then tachisoyo, which is was closed, a passive or state change. But in English, close can be either transitive or intransitive. So as a transitive, the subject is an agent. I closed the door. The subject is an agent. But for the intransitive, the door closed, the subject is a patient. And it's kind of like a passive verb. And so because of that, Koreans and Japanese will often make these errors. The door was closed, but when really the meaning is the door is a state change, the door closed by itself. Because if you say was closed, you're implying that there's an agent involved. But maybe you don't know, or it's not relevant, you just say the door closed. Now when you say, number 2, this aspect of our society must be changed, and while it's grammatical, does it really make sense in this context? This aspect of society, its gender attitudes must be changed. Does that make logical sense here? You would probably say must or should change, because if you say must be changed, you're implying an agent. Must be changed by what? By mind control, by force, by God or magic or something, I don't know. You kind of like, what? Must be changed by what? When you're just saying it needs to change, it needs to undergo a change. And likewise, the stock market index should be increased. Should be increased? How? How are you going to increase it? By magic? By manipulating the stock market? I mean, it's kind of weird here. So what you really mean is it should increase. It needs to increase. It should increase before we sell these things. So it would sound funny to use the passive in these contexts when the meaning is an active state change meaning. So we already talked about that. Closed, and also break is the same way. The window broke, state change. The window was broken by baseball versus the transitive burglar broke the window. So break works similarly. In fact, gejida is the Korean verb for break, so like it broke. So the G morpheme is used in some Korean verbs because it's a state change. gejida. So in the literature, we'll talk more about these later in linguistics research. These are some common semantic roles. There may be others and different theories about semantic roles. Locative, location, like for example with prepositional phrases. Dative is like to, I gave the boy a ball. So the boy is an indirect object to whom something is given. And the similar meaning, semantic role is the benefactive, which is maybe more often expressed with for. She baked him a cake, and it's not the same as I gave the boy a ball, not exactly. I gave the boy a ball. I could also say I gave a ball to the boy. You could paraphrase it with to, and that's your true dative. But she baked him a cake, and in some languages I'll treat that as a dative. But technically, for example, in English, if you want to paraphrase it, I wouldn't say she baked a cake to him. You would say what? For him. And that for indicates a benefactive. So dative is more like giving something to somebody. I gave the boy a ball. But benefactive is slightly different. And in the morphology of some languages, they overlap. They're kind of put together. But sometimes there are distinctions. So she baked him a cake is she baked a cake for him, which is, so the emphasis is not on giving, but the cake, transferring the possession of the cake, but just that he benefits from this. He is the one who benefits from an action. Or another term is sometimes recipient. So sometimes you see the verb, the semantic role might be called a recipient. In fact, the verb receive. I received a present. I received a present. Is I the agent? Is it a patient? Probably not. Maybe you could argue that, but more commonly it would be called a benefactive or a recipient. So the subject of to receive is a recipient or a benefactive, depending on your theory of semantics. Another term for these things, for semantic roles, is argument structure. When you talk about syntax and language processing, they often use the term argument structure and arguments. So a semantic role is an argument. So the reason for this terminology comes from logic. I'll give you a brief taste of formal theoretical semantics next time. It's loads of fun, not really. The book doesn't go into it much, thank God, because it's kind of interesting, but it's not exciting stuff necessarily. But it's really important to some concepts in semantics. So a lot of semantics came out of work in philosophy, philosophical semantics, where they use things like logic and symbolic logic notation and set theory to represent the meaning of sentences and to explain sentence meaning. And so they use this sort of functional notation. So if you remember your high school, middle school math, you learn about function notations, like f of x. So that's a function, and x is a variable in a function. Well, so in philosophical semantics, they use this function notation to represent the meanings of verbs. So if you say run is like a function, it's a verb, and the subject, like x, is like, the boy ran. So the x is sort of like a variable. So in this case, the subject is, an agent. Break, and the agent, and the subject could be a patient, for example. Or break, the transitive break, like the boy broke the window. You have two arguments in the function. So it's called, the x and y is called an argument in this notation. The boy broke the window, so x and y, two arguments. So I will maybe switch back and forth. Sometimes I'll say semantic roles, or more often I say argument and argument structure. We talk about the argument structure of a verb. What arguments does this verb take? Does it take one or two or three arguments, and what kind of arguments, or what kind of semantic roles? And another term you'll come across, especially in Chomskyan syntax, is theta roles. Chomskyan syntacticians, they took semantic role theory and they kind of modified it and called it theta roles, so they talk about them as theta roles. But you'll see that sometimes in the older syntax books with semantic roles. So next time I'm going to talk about some of the traditional philosophical or formal semantics, not because it's really practical, but because some of the terminology we use comes from that. So, for example, the King of France is bald. Is that a true statement? Really? Does France have a king? So this is a classical sentence used in semantics. Well, is it true or false? Well, it sounds like a true statement, but there is no king of France, not today anymore. But you can imagine an alternate history, if history had gone differently, or if you hopped into a time machine and went back in time and changed things, there could be a king of France. It doesn't exist, but it's possible hypothetically. And then think about whether that's true or false. We'll get into that next time and true statements, because that affects some of the grammar terms that we use today. But enjoy your homework, the short paper assignment.